Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second day of Accelerating Clean Energy in India, or ACE. Before we begin today's conference, I would like to inform all of you that today's event is an in-person event, and we will have a few distinguished speakers who will join us virtually. The event is being recorded and will be uploaded to our social media pages and our website. Please do see our display of publications, which are kept outside as well for everyone. I would like to request everyone to please keep their phones in silent mode during the event. With this note, I'd like to welcome you all again. And just to give you a recap of what happened on day one of ACE, we had a session which talked about how can cities lead India's clean energy transition. And if India is to achieve its net zero emissions by 2070, cities will need to be at the forefront. We also spoke about how states are approaching the clean energy transition, and the lessons and experiences were shared by various stakeholders from the states of Assam, Jharkhand, Kerala, and Tamil Nadu, with all of these states having a very unique energy demand and supply portfolio. We also had an expert panel that spoke about how India can strengthen its critical mineral supply chain in alignment with the country's energy transition goals. So to begin the day with a high-level plenary on cross-sectoral partnerships on energy transition, achieving a successful clean energy transition hinges on an economy-wide collaboration of diverse stakeholders, spanning industry leaders, policymakers, innovators, and the youth. The plenary aims to explore the industry's landscape, promote the exchange of ideas and experiences across the entire value chain, driving responsible and sustainable progress in energy transition. So I'd like to now call upon our distinguished guests on stage for the plenary. We have Dr. Sambit Basu, who is the Director of Programs and Chief Energy Economist of Power Foundation of India. Dr. Basu has over 2.5 decades of experience covering policy research, advocacy, consulting, and leading rural initiatives. He has professionally engaged with several regulators, government, private sector, development banks, and communities in India and abroad. Next, we have Mr. Shishir Garimela. Who is the head of International Business Development of PV Evolutions Lab, a leading quality and reliability testing lab for solar modules based in Napa, California. Shishir is responsible for PVEL's expansion into strategic geographies around the world. Next, we have Ms. Aarti Khosla, who is the founder and director of Climate Trends. Ms. Khosla works at the intersection of strategic communications and policy outreach on environment, conservation, and climate change. She has over 15 years of experience in environmental communications. Along with Climate Trends, she is also the founder-director of Carbon Copy, an effort to offer latest news and updates on climate and energy issues in India. We also have Ms. Kajol, who is a senior program manager at the energy program in WRI-India. Her primary focus is on energy efficiency and clean energy activities for commercial and industrial customers. And lastly, we would like to invite Madhav Pai, who's the CEO of WRI-India, to host the plenary. Madhav's been part of the Institute's founding team way back in 2008. He's played leadership role in WRI through supporting design, implementation, and scaling of pioneering solutions to India's complex challenges. So over to you, Madhav.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of this event. We have, as you heard from Landwin, we have a very diverse panel, and I think since we're going to talk about cross-sectoral, approaches needed for the energy transition, I think that makes complete sense. So, the idea is for each of them to sort of speak for 7-8 minutes, and then hopefully we can, try to get some questions, and then maybe do one more round. You're welcome to go up there and speak, or you are welcome to speak from your desk, so I will leave that to you. Just to kick it off, just to say a few things, we are in the middle of the energy transition. 2, 3, 4 of our NDCs are completely focused on the energy transition. And the big challenge now, it's not so much, the whole conversation of installed capacity that we've been having. How do we move from that to actually integrating all of this sort of new energy into the grid? And then, the bigger challenges of, that, doesn't get spoken much about is both sort of the institutional structures that are required to make this energy transition also, but what happens to the current fossil fuel resources, right? How do we, what happens to the existing coal plants? What happens to places whose economies are completely dependent on this? What happens to all of the tax revenue that states get from selling petrol and diesel which is an important part of their sort of economics. So these are very, very important things. To a large extent, we were focused on, installing renewable energy, driven mostly by, Ministry of New and Renewable Energy, some of the new institutions that we have created. But now this conversation is, as Lanvin mentioned, becoming all of economy, right? Is economy wide. At the other side, we want to make sure that the just transition conversation, that people, who are part of the old economy don't get lost. That is an important. The third side of this is, we want to make sure that that is sort of reliable energy for all. I'll just talk about a couple of pieces of work that at WRI we have been doing, which many of you may be also be familiar. One is around basically, distributed renewable energy for healthcare centers, right? And that work was in Jharkhand. There's work in Jharkhand, Rajasthan, Assam, and we've probably participated in about 50 such installations. There's probably 3 to 4,000 such installations across the country. We've looked at really healthcare centers, education, some around agriculture. This is the classic opportunity, right? How do you embed, the electrification of schools, and so how does an education department build a budget around this? How does a health department build a budget around this, where, sort of that, using this DRE is part of their programming, and how do you build these relationships then? So that's sort of one example. The other thing is, of course, we and Kajol is also here, but we've been working quite a bit with MSMEs, and I think we have some. She might also speak about it. But again, we've worked across 5-6 states. Probably 1,000 odd units, a little more than that, and there, I mean, again, just starting to engage with these MSMEs who've been through really tough times in the last few years over COVID. You start to see all of these sort of elements of the transition that we talk about, right? So one, the just transition comes up, the sort of just the bottom line interests, and, the challenges of overcoming the sort of big setbacks that a lot of these people face during the sort of COVID period is, front and center. And then, things like today, competitiveness, global competitiveness is really the driver. So with these broad ideas, how do we make sure that they make the energy transition, that they, do it justly, that women don't lose out in this process, all become extremely important. And now, I mean, also, making sure the air pollution, even today as well, is a key issue. Again, how does this energy transition also, how do we use these lens of competitiveness or clean air, and to be able to sort of talk about this transition in industry. So again, EVs is the other big area of work at WRI. We've been working very closely on the e-bus transition, and I mean, personally, I've worked with public buses for the last 20 years, and I never imagined that, India will have 300,000 electric buses in the next 5 years. But now it really seems like it's going to be possible. And so I think that rapid transition is also happening. What are the implications of that? How do we make sure that sort of planning for that happens? So again, these are industry, power, buildings, all of these sectors are very critical. Of course, also we are talking about the allied sectors of agriculture, education, health. So big opportunities, and I think that's sort of the conversation we want to drive at today is how do we drive this integration, and again, are there common lessons? Are there things to watch out for? How can some of these sort of distributed efforts end up moving towards these large goals? So broadly, these are sort of the ideas. That's the conversation. So with that, I'd like to invite Mr. Sambit Basu. He's at the he's at the Power Foundation, and would love to sort of hear from you. Again, feel free to go up, or you can speak from there.
Fine, I'll speak from here. Am I audible? Yeah. So thanks for, first I want to thank WRI and thank you, Madhav, for giving me this opportunity to come here and speak and share the dais with such eminence. But I just want to start with a short disclaimer that my views are my personal and not for the organization that I represent. because as you understand that we work as a society under the Ministry of Power. So with that and without much ado, I'll just come directly to the point. The two issues, I think, what Tirthankar told me, which are very relevant, which is the first is that how is India, how the way that it is evolving in terms of transition, how is it different from the other rest of the world? And second, very importantly, is that um, how are these ambitious targets, in some sense, which are being laid down, is embedded in the development agenda of the country? So I will just restrict myself to four broad areas. So if we remember the NDCs, and a lot has been spoken already about it, uh, the one is with respect to the emission intensity, which is about 45% of reduction from the 2005 levels to 2030. And the second is 50% of our installed capacity will be in electric capacity will be from non-fossil fuels. So, and of course, the other thing is about a transition towards net zero. So these three things, if I restrict myself, and I'll be speaking primarily from the perspective of power sector. So if we look at the way that it has been planned in national electricity plans and other things, and we are quite aware of the kind of capacity multiplication that is being spoken about. So while the peak demand goes up substantially, the overall capacity goes up to 900 gigawatts by 2030. And so, so the question that 2032, so the question that comes up is that how is this plan being done in the first place, and whether it makes, so what it translates to is that coal doesn't get dethroned, okay? I mean, in the sense that it gets reduced from 50% what it is today to 29%. And solar kind of goes up from 17 to 40%. But what we're talking about is that to add in another 10 years' time, or less than 10 years' time, some 300 gigawatts of solar, okay, and 80 gigawatts of wind. I'm just restricting myself to just a few numbers. And what you are talking about, while the coal comes down, but the coal still gets added, whatever is there in the pipeline, about 26 gigawatts. So what it gets added is, you just take or leave some 12 gigawatts or something, so 48 gigawatts or something what gets added for the coal. Now the question that comes is that this, if you look at these numbers, are we saying that this, I mean, even the NGCs to some extent was, the highlight was that we did very well in COP21, and we keep on harping that we achieved by before time in 11 years, in 9 years, and those kind of stuff. And then so we revised and went back and changed the question is that, are we really looking at all the parameters, all the constraints, all the sectoral constraints and the growth patterns? Because if we look at energy intensity and emission intensity, the pattern of growth of GDP has been very different in India. We skipped the entire industrialization. We skipped the entire manufacturing. So we grew at about 7% or something. But if you see the composition of our GDP, it's about 65% is services sector, 22% is 63% is services, 22% is about is what it is industrial contribution, and 15% is agricultural contribution. Now, this is not what historically, so this obviously, when you look at the energy intensity or emission intensity, the numerator and the denominator defines very clearly that the growth and how we have been able to manage our energy intensity and emission intensity. But going forward, we are talking about aspirations till 2047 when India turns 100. We are talking about large numbers. It can be ranging between various economists come up with and various organizations come up with very different numbers, 20 trillion to 35 trillion. And we are talking about per capita incomes going up anywhere between $15,000 US dollars to 25,000 US dollars. So, which is tremendously higher than, I mean, several, I mean, notches higher than what we are today. And we have a very large population. We are the most populous, it's 1.4 billion. And we also, in 2030, we are going to be having the youngest population, largest in terms of the working age population. By 2030, McKinsey has come up with a report. So now the question is that if we have to cater to these, and we also have to recognize there's a huge amount of multidimensional poverty which Niti Aayog themselves have come up with. So in terms of access to education, health, and nutrition, and basic amenities, so we are still not there. So we are talking about these things and talking about a growth, and we're talking about infrastructural development, and we are talking about 7.6% growth to reach where 2047, where we are going to be. How do we propose to do that with only renewables? I mean, I really don't know. And so we keep on going back and change the narratives. Are these really taken into consideration when we did that optimization? So the question is that when we do an optimization, when we have an objective function, if the objective function is to maximize development and the growth, subject to certain realities and certain constraints, are we taking all these realities and constraints into consideration? So that is the, or else what we'll have to do is we have to go and change the narratives very frequently. And if we see that all this noise around we are doing in terms of the renewables, and that's very good, and we have been leaders, and we rightly should be, because we have 65% of the population living in rural areas. We have a largest coastline, about 7,500 kilometers. 15.5% of the people live on the coastal areas. They're most vulnerable to climate change. And we are the climate warriors. We are doing great. But we also have to be realistic in terms of what we can do with the global development agenda. So the budget, the last budget, if we see that we talked about that, what, 10 lakh crores, what they added in terms of the capacity is about 33% higher. And if you look at those numbers, and it was talked about highly in terms of this, we've done so much in terms of the green, but you actually see the allocation is only 10%. The 80% is towards growth-driven sectors, which is transport, which is defense, which is all this kind of other railways and so many other things. So it is very important to recognize that, yes, the past is, I mean, the future is not a reflection of the past. So if we have to do that, how do we propose to do that? Now, let me come, so we have talked about growth. Now, let's talk about the renewables. We are talking about 30 gigawatts to be added every year if we are talking about solar in terms of just the solar. How do we propose to do that? Because then we have to say that, okay, we can do that, because it then talks about $20 billion annually. I mean, so how do we propose to get that money from where? If you have $400 billion in US in terms of the IRA, so all the investment goes there, all the money goes there. Does it come to India? How do we attract that money into India? It is not easy, and 50% of our investments into the solar is foreign investments. Okay, so which means that 70% if it's the debt component of any you're talking, and then 50% of that has to come from the foreign. It's a large sum of money, right? So we need to get that kind of money. Now the other part is that, forget about the funding. Where is the equipment going to come from? The equipment side, we have to import that. We make such a big thing that, okay, we have to go import, we have to do renewables because we want to kind of be self-reliant. We want to move away from being importers of the coal, importers of the fossil fuel. We want to kind of have energy security. But now you are kind of importing equipments from elsewhere because it is cheaper and you don't have the capability. So the government pushes for more capability. So what you do is that you PLIs, you do some kind of so through PLIs, you boost the manufacturing, but the PLI says up to, with respect to sales. It does not say that you can sell to India or you can sell to abroad. Okay? So it with respect PLIs with respect to sales. It just does not say anything. Okay? It also has on the demand, so create more demand for the manufacturing. What you do, you have the approved list of manufacturers and modules and manufacturers. So you restrict there. Okay? You have domestic components which needs to be created. So you do all of this. Okay? So, but you have mandated the developers to do all of that. If you have to get the government approved, government subsidies or government projects or those kind of. So you've created that. But you have not had the similar thing on the manufacturers. If you do that, then you kill that. Okay? So you don't do that. So now what happens is that, number one, you don't have enough manufacturing capability. Second, if you boost that manufacturing capability, there's no guarantee it will go towards the domestic. So it may still go to the US market, which obviously will be. So the exports have actually gone up. So the PLIs, it's not mandated from both the sides, and you can't possibly do that. So it does not help such a thing. So the policies of cross-sectoral policies sometimes are not speaking to each other. Okay, so that's the second thing about in terms of the thing. The third is that even if you do all of that, then again the price that you will get. You don't have the capability in terms of value chain. The third is that most of these are in special economic zones, manufacturing can be set up. The output is treated as an export. So the BCDs, the basic custom duties may be applicable on them also, the output that is coming out. So it doesn't help them. So it's at the same time, that is the same thing is that you are just producing domestically, you're creating a barrier on that. All right? So that's the second component of the thing. The third, I'm coming to the important aspect, is that if you look at the total coal-based generation that we have in the country, what is there in the pipeline, it's about 26 gigawatts, 1.6 gigawatts in the private, 26 gigawatts is under construction for the thing. Now, the most important part is that you have more than 500 coal thermal units in the country, which about 212 gigawatts. If you look at the median age of these plants, they are 12 to 14 years, which means that if you have to live for 40 years, you are very young in terms of a fleet size. How do you propose to have energy transition away from the coal and decarbonize if you have such a young fleet which is sitting out there? So it is really very wishful, and which is very risky also. Now, if we come to the states for the same thing, the 6 states which we know are coal rich, they are having what, about 40% of the total number of districts are in there, and 33% are extremely intensive in terms of those districts. 13 million people kind of depend on those on the coal and allied sectors, and you have in these particular states again, the median age of the power plants, which are 80 to 90% total installed capacity, are in the range of 10 to 12 years. So they are still very young. They have a per capita income in these states, which are most of them are half of what the national average is. So their capability is very low. And finally, their outstanding liability of these states are extremely high in terms of the GSDP, which is 20 to 30%, which is far more than what it can attract investments into this. And there clearly shows the development agenda in these particular states will not be driven, it will not be possible. On top of that, you impose RPOs and RGOs on them. So what do? If you see their installed capacity of RE as a share of their potential is very low. So what do? They move and buy the things if they have the money. Number one, they may not have the money. Second, if they have the money to comply with, they will go somewhere else to buy. So what will happen is that the Gujarat and the Maharashtra and Rajasthan will ultimately develop, but these states will not develop. So you will ultimately have the same thing which happened long time where the freight equalization policy is now brought by something else. So it is in some sense is common, but differentiated responsibility is not between the states. It is between countries, not between the states. So that is again a very important agenda. And finally, what we have is that our growth has not been DRE driven. It's not distributed. We have not been able to add rooftop so much. There may be issues, obviously, but every DRE is not rooftop. It is like saying that distributed energy means bringing your supply closer to your point of use. And by doing away with ISTS, by doing away with all the charges, what you are essentially doing is that you are making 3 rupees, what is valid in one state is 3 rupees valid in another state. Now, nothing comes for free. I don't understand this whole thing as why something should be equal. Why should everything be charged equal? Nothing is charged equal. Tomato is not charged equally. Onion is not charged equally. So why should electricity be charged equally from one state to the other? So in the process, you are not helping these things. So having said so much on this, what I'm trying to say is that it is time for us to connect these dots. Okay, so stop looking in isolation and to focus more on R&D, which is on 0.7% of the GSB for God knows how many years. Since I started doing my PhD, I remember it's 0.7% of the GDP. So it still is and it depends on pharmaceuticals or the defense. Rest of the people can go to hell. Or it depends on private sector to come forward and do everything for yourself. So I think it is time, because what is required is high efficiency, low emission technologies. It does not necessarily mean renewable. It means that you need to have clean, efficient technologies. And we all know about Gibbon's paradox, that efficient does not necessarily mean conservation. So it's basically, we have to be very careful about, and coal doesn't need to be wished away all totally. So that's all. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. And I think you've really set the context for the conversation. And really pointing out to all of the to a lot of the sort of cross-sectoral challenges and need to have this bigger dialogue and policy making that is much more coordinated. So thank you very much for that. Now I'll call upon Shirish. Sorry, I was Shishir, right? No, I was with Shirish yesterday, so I've been very confused. Shishir Garimela, he's with PV Solutions Lab, and he's going to talk to us about, yeah, please.
Could you share my screen, please? Today, I'm going to speak to you about one Mr. Gupta. Mr. Gupta lives in Mumbai. He's got a chemical factory in a place called Tarapur, which is about an hour and a half away from Mumbai. And India has 63 million such Mr. Guptas that are the backbone of the Indian economy. For them to add value to decarbonization and productivity, rooftop solar, distributed energy in form of rooftop solar is very critical. So today I'm going to speak to you about what Mr. Gupta really wants. He wants to go solar, but he really doesn't know how. And there are some fundamental issues within the market that we can easily resolve as industry. So what does the MSME solar opportunity look like? In one simple picture, it looks like this. And I think it looks like a rocket ship for two reasons. Because the Indian small business owner does not care about decarbonization, they care about money. And anywhere in India, regardless of the industry, regardless of the SME cluster, rooftop solar is parity, CNI grid parity for tariff, which is why the payback is very quick and they save a lot of money on the electricity bill. Please bear in mind that electricity is a very important top 3 input cost for every MSME in India. And with the cross subsidy and agricultural people not paying too much and residential being given subsidy in various parts of India, it's the CNI that takes it's the CNI electricity cost that takes the brunt. And hence rendering us effectively unproductive. So first, you save money. The second is actually, this is a little bit more behavioral. Mr. Gupta has his end customer, which is an auto company in Germany. Now, when they come for a field trip, they visit the factory, they see solar on his factory, they feel very excited. That company in Germany has a decarbonization, ESG, 2050, all forms of goals on them. And they have the pressure on supply chain to make it green. Now, when you're talking about the world in today's time, no country is devoid of this ESG and decarbonization matrix, right? So while Mr. Gupta might be a small auto component manufacturer or a chemical manufacturer, what he's bringing to the table is A, solar saves me money, and 2, I look better in front of my customers in India and my customers for abroad, especially for exports. So if it is really that easy, why is it not happening? Why is rooftop solar not taken off in the MSME sector in India? There are multiple reasons. Some of them are policy and regulatory. In fact, a big chunk of them are policy and regulatory, but we're not going to talk about that because over the last 15 years, I've figured out that that is not something that I can or we can solve alone. There is a complicated structure around center, state, dynamics, politics. So we will keep that away. But as someone who's spent many years as a last mile practitioner, there are 3 things that we can make easy for Mr. Gupta and his brothers so they can go solar. And those are the 3 things that I want to speak to you about in the next 7 to 8 minutes. The first is the ease of customer acquisition. If you want to run a solar business or any form of distributed energy business, sitting in your office and trying to do WhatsApp and email and digital marketing is not going to solve the problem. Over my years of spending time across at least 10 to 15 states in India, each of them, by the way, has 5 to 6 various industrial clusters. Look at Maharashtra, look at Karnataka, there are at least 5 big tier 2 towns or cities that have a very vibrant industrial culture. How do you access them? This picture is what I could think of. Meet them in person, drink chai with them, and then make them like you because then they trust you, right? And there is no rocket science to this. The only way to solve for customer acquisition in India for MSME is to visit the industrial clusters and meet with the industrial clusters. It could be a single industry or a multiple industry cluster. Let's take an example of my visit to Chittorgarh. There is a big marble cluster, and I visited them in 2017. Sabke sar latke hue the. And I didn't understand why, because, you know, marble is an energy intensive. They had this beautiful Rajasthan sun falling on them, big roofs. The reason is they were recently, at that time they had 28% GST, which is not a nice number to have on their sale. And second is a lot of their business was in cash, and demonetization had just happened in 2016. Now, that is a very specific industry problem that you would have never realized if you had not gone to that cluster. There is a cluster in Tamil Nadu, obviously you would have heard of it, called Tirupur. Why is Tirupur always spoken of as a very big, forward-looking culture of decarbonization and sustainability? The big reason is because they do a lot of textile exports, right? And it's the export customers that are driving the demand. So visiting the cluster is very important. Meeting the cluster is very important. Having chai and samosas at the industrial association is very important. You would not find any other place in India where there is so much word of mouth and WhatsApp groups that kick in when it comes to they're looking at each other, they're looking at their industrial association to drive the agenda. So if we want to solve the MSME rooftop cluster, rooftop issue in India, for that matter, any MSME intervention, including energy efficiency, as you rightly pointed out, we have to go meet them, and we have to go meet them multiple times till we gain the trust. And we have to go to all of them, not just one or two and then copy ideas from one to the other, because every state, every language, every industry is different. Second is the ease of financing. Now, we can talk at length about how much financing India needs. I just want to leave you with two thoughts that I have from my time on the ground, where I think these are two interventions that can immediately help the customers unlock financing. Firstly, that equation there is what in finance is called co-lending. Co-lending is where you have a NBFC, which is a nimble, last mile, aggressive, that's why the picture of shark, looking, it's the NBFC sales guy who goes to the last mile cluster. They are the front end of financing, right? They are the ones who are going to the customers and meeting them. But behind them, through the co-lending arrangement, is you have the State Bank of India and the big banks with big balance sheets. They have the capital, they have the cost of capital, but they're very slow, which is why I've denoted them as an elephant, right? But when they come together, this is what happens. If 20% of the loan at 14% interest rate is on an NBFC book, and 80% of the loan, the other part is with SBI, SBI is still sitting in the office and just looking at a credit, they're not leaving their desks. It's the NBFC that's making the effort. Take some form of that equation, and you can change those numbers to 15, 11, all of that. That's just semantics. But effectively, what happens is the interest rate for the final customer goes down significantly. Co-lending has helped various industries in India. I've seen that happen when I was doing solar for last mile financing. And I think that's one thing that's that's still not looked at as a big market for ease of financing. And this is an immediate intervention. The second intervention is technology. You've heard of fintech. You've heard of all these NBFCs coming to your app and instant loans and things like that. We have seen technology playing a very big role in underwriting. Indian lenders have been trained to believe that if your loan is not paid, I'll take away your house. If your business loan is not paid, I'll take away your factory. That mindset of having collateral-based lending has to change. And we need to start thinking about revenue-based, cash flow-based financing. Technology, GST data is all digital. All of this is very, very clearly available now for people to make decisions. That's why alternate underwriting is critical. NBFCs are doing it. Let's support them with the lending from the banks to get this market moving. The other thing is there is a fascination with underwriting where the banks should move and start using technology, which they already are, for collections. doesn't matter if the person's not going to pay a loan or not. The way MSME paybacks work is you call up the person on a Monday and say, sir, aapka EMI due hai. Then you call up on a Tuesday and you say EMI due hai. Then you call up on a Wednesday and you keep doing that. And you know what the MSME Mr. Guptas of the world tell me is that जो सबसे ज़्यादा शोर मचाता है हम उनका लोन पहले चुकाते हैं, right? So it's the collections that are more important in real India than it is this underwriting which is based on some Excel sheet, right? Yeah, last comment is service. Mr. Gupta wants to go solar, he doesn't know how to. Very quickly, there are 3 people he needs to be away from. First one is the fly-by-night operators. These are people who are doing business today, tomorrow they might do something else. Second is the person who gives a discount for everything, right? These are people who are local opportunists who would just want business for anything. Third is people who look very strong when it comes to their quality, but their service is not available. So my last comment here is that pick the MSME rooftop solar customer needs global products that are uniquely positioned, but also local service. You know, we all use Urban Clap, but we have that one person that we call as an electrician when something goes wrong. So Real India works on service, not as much on product. So that's it from my side. All I want to leave you with is that if India wants to be a $5 trillion economy, getting our MSMEs, which are 63 million of them, have to be extremely productive, and these are some ways that we can do that. Thank you.
Now I'd like to ask Kajol to really talk about the steel sector decarbonization conversation and India's energy transition to green steel.
Thanks, Madhav, and thanks, Shishir, for touching upon the industries and starting with the SMEs. Now I can move to the large-scale industries. So we already know now the industries are important sector, and this is where where we want to have, and as the panel also talks about the cross-sectoral. So it's not just about talking about the one sector, but the multiple sectors, and industries is one core sector in that, which heavily rely on the fossil fuel for not just for their meeting their demand, but for their higher temperature demand. And in the 2022, we know that they were the ones who were almost consuming 1/4 of the carbon emissions. To give the numbers, they emitted about 9 gigatons of CO2 emission that accounts for the 1/4 of the global emissions. So, and with the rapid industrialization, which is going to particularly happen in the low to the medium scale industries, this number is going to go up if the right measures are not being taken. And especially when we talk about the global south or for the low and a medium scale industries, electrification for the decarbonization is a far-fetched opportunity. That's not one of the options. So we have to look at the gamut of solutions where we can look at how the deep decarbonization can happen. And this requires a lot of conversations, not just from top to bottom, but from left to right also. We need to have a lot of collaboration and understanding how the deep decarbonization can happen. So just to begin with the work that we have also done with some of the sectors and the work that we are doing. So over the last decades, what we have observed is that there has been a significant development. It's not that when we say that the industries are just consuming, at the same time they're also trying their best to reduce their energy consumption, being it utilization of the energy efficient technologies, trying to adopt some of these technologies. There are struggles, there are challenges, but there have been a movement. And under that movement recently, it's not very recent though, it's almost a decade, but Perform, Achieve and Trade scheme was one of them, which was being launched for the designated consumer, the large consumers, and the steel sector, the hard-to-abate, the so-called hard-to-abate sectors were one of them. And there is a substantial amount of the hard-to-abate sectors that we have in India. And to define the hard-to-abate sectors, the production of the iron, steel, cement, non-ferrous metals, chemicals, they all account for the hard-to-abate. And the decarbonization for these are very important. Already, the energy efficiency part has started. The renewable is still on the way. Now we have to go a little 2 steps ahead to look at the decarbonization. So the decarbonization requires a string of options, which is like technological revolutions in each of the emitting sectors. So energy efficiency was just to begin, and they create the pillar around it. So further towards that, to realize India's commitment towards the decarbonization, Ministry of Steel created 13 task forces, which looked at like how the engagement can be brought in from the academias, from the think tank, from the SNTs, and from the different industries all together can come at one platform and can look at the different aspects of production for the green steel, or the so-called for the decarbonization of the steel. WRI was part of a couple of these task forces, and either as a member or as a knowledge partner. And just to name, green hydrogen was one of them. And what we realized while we were having a discussions with a lot of the industry, industrialists, and for the academia and from the researchers, green hydrogen is one of the options. It's not the only solution. There has to be a lot done before we actually look at the decarbonization of the steel sector. And for the decarbonization, there has to be a gradual move towards the better improvement towards the process side. Currently, mostly the steel production uses the blast furnace. We have to move towards the much more efficient, the DRI system, where even the green hydrogen can be blended much more easily. So it's not just about looking at the final solution, which is green hydrogen, and then talking about it, but it's also the process and the pathway that has to be much more clearer. The technology for the DRI, which is currently using the coke or the coke oven gas blending, or either with the natural gas, we have to start looking at what technologies can make more sense when we have to start blending with the green hydrogen. Considering all these factors, and there were certain recommendations that were being given to Ministry of Steel, which looked at like when the technology will make more sense, so the cost becomes more important there. So the cost break even can only be managed by 2030. So when we are looking at the decarbonization, it's not like it will happen just immediately. It is a process which will take some time. And this is the time that we need to start preparing ourselves. So based upon the price projections and the break-even, it's indicated that around to take up the green hydrogen, the price has to reduce to about $1 per kg. That too even in the ambitious projections as per the MNRE figures that we have taken. And this will only be achieved by 2029 or 2030. So decarbonization of the energy input to the industrial sector requires a high amount of all the commitments, which is for the stepwise decarbonization from the process to looking at the technological advancements to looking at the financials, which will make more sense. So various novel technologies that will create, and another one is that we have been talking about is the carbon capture. But there are other sensitive and the critical issues that we first need to resolve as we also talk about the carbon capture and storage technologies. And the use of these technologies are still underway when we talk about them. So these were the discussions which were happening at the center level. We also have to look at how these translate at the state level. So that's where we need to look at how the state level decarbonization strategies speak to the center level strategies. So a collaborative alliance with the policies, with the share of resources and addressing some unique challenges. Yesterday we heard during our state session that there is a lot of work which needs to be done at the state level itself, and Jharkhand was one of that state, where we are also trying to work with the Jharkhand government to look at from the sustainable just energy transition point of view and industrial decarbonization. Jharkhand is one of that state which has a number of hard-to-abate industries and also at the same time dependency on the fossil fuel. So that becomes a very critical task force to repurpose the industries for the green energy. For decarbonization, individual hard-to-abate sectors and declining cost of the variable renewable energy provides a viable opportunities for substantial reduction and eventual elimination in the unabated coal generation. The chemical sector requires a heterogeneous approach towards it due to the vast variety of products and the processes, while the other sectors also has to look at how energy intensity and enhancement of resources and circular economy becomes a critical component for them. The current options are expensive and requires a robust government support for research, development, and deployment. And at the same time, while we are talking about this, the cost of low carbon technology need to come down with better research and developments, and these cost reductions needs to align with the current requirements for the India. We can adopt it from the other countries, but we also have to see how they can be tweaked for our own country. So strategic developments around the policies are required. And at the same time, when we are talking about these large industries, we can't really forget these small and medium scale industries. We already heard, and in the session 2, we'll be hearing more about them, how the SMEs, which are the backbone for the economy, and also the employing the major chunk of our, major chunks are being employed in the SMEs, are important to look at from the decarbonization point of view. When we look at, especially for the small and the medium scale industries, they are either the supply chain of these large industries. So they can becomes like a whole gamut of solutions. It's not just about looking from the one sector, but it's about their supply chain also. And these MSMEs then now needs to translate from, as I started with the central level to state level to the cluster level. So this is the whole gamut that we have to look at the different levels that have to have a solutions around the decarbonization. So in just conclusion, the industrial decarbonization is definitely a crucial aspect for our broader energy transition, and the cross-sectoral partnership, the center level to state level to the cluster level discussion needs to enhance the effectiveness of these efforts to foster more collaborations, innovation, coordination actions, and across the diverse industries, from the steel to their supply chain, from the cement to their supply chain, to textile to their supply chain. This collective approach is essential for addressing the complexities which is there around the decarbonization. And I just want to highlight that there are some of the key reasons why the industrial decarbonization is more important. We need to definitely look at how the better collaborations can happen around the technologies, the investment and the finances. Already we heard, there are these ways of improving, either it's through the peer-to-peer learning or the finances. We'll be hearing more on the next sessions on why and how we create more investments in financing around the decarbonization, because although we look at the industries are the profit making, but there's still a big gap, and there is a big challenge around the investment and the finances, which varies from sector to sector and from the large to a small scale industries. The another is the policy alignment.
Kajal, can you wrap up?
Yeah, I'm just closing this. So another is the policy alignment. So the cross-sectoral partnership needs to align from the center, state to the cluster level. The green public procurement, the CBAM, the recently being announced, the CBAM, which is having a multiple effect on the industries. There are both positive and there are some repercussions which the industries are, so it's still under discussion, but that's one other important aspect, the cross-border market adjustment, which needs to put for the carbon adjustment, and that would become the motivation for the industries. The another and the very important, and which is what I want to close it, is the job creation, or the just and the fair and equitable transition. So while we are talking about all these transitions, it has to be more important to have a fair and equitable transition across the sectors, which brings in the more cohesiveness for the industries to look at how better the job creations can be done. There has been happening all these transitions, but we need to make that these transitions are speaking to each other, they are more cohesive, and nobody is left behind while we are talking about it. There are better skills which are being developed, there are better jobs which are being created with the decarbonization as well. So thank you with this.
Thank you very much. So now Aarti, especially if you also can talk about the climate and energy linkages, and and also any global examples if you want to cite. So yeah, over to you.
Sure, and a lot of ground has been covered. I personally and also my organization, we invest a lot of time in tracking how the narratives on energy and climate are shaping up across the world, and I thought I'll throw some things out there mostly in that context. 1 week from now will be the Conference of Parties, which is happening in Dubai this year. COP28, as it's called, is in high contention because at a time when temperature records are being broken, we are having a petrostate hosting a COP. Without getting into the merits of how really you can reduce emissions while you can still keep the sources alive, I think it also speaks to how much complex the whole discussion on climate has been, and energy transition just assumes a very, very central status in all of that. A lot of us in the room, I assume, are also coming to this from the point of view of climate action, as it's called, and therefore at least important to note that last week was the first time ever in history that the temperature breached 2 degrees centigrade. Perhaps those of you who have been in the conference have discussed about it, but even if it's a temporary breach, even if the overshoot is going to come back to some lesser degree, it's really, while we were talking about climate change, it's happened in front of us. So I suppose we are witness to that breach happening for the first time, and everything else in the context of putting more renewables, getting more finance, electrifying everything, whether it's building, transport, energy, power sector, industry, is really in the context of how fast we can build our actions so that the overshoot is A, less, and B, it's really not permanent. That's one thing that I wanted to put out. When the G20 happened in India, there was for the first time a discussion, or at least as I understood, on the tripling of renewable energy. But that seems to be really the flavor as well of this COP. I suppose the things to keep in mind will be what tripling means, how tripling can be facilitated, and who triples. One of the speakers spoke about what in climate jargon is very famously known as CBDRRC, which is common but differentiated responsibility with respective capabilities. That itself is evolving, both in terms of who will put money, but also in terms of who will take action. The Paris Agreement quite diluted who will take action. Everyone comes with voluntary agreements, voluntary commitments on what they will do. That is what NDCs are about. So you have taken away the whole concept of binaries in that sense, and just in terms of your respective capabilities, you take action. But I suppose the point about climate ambition is quite pointless without climate finance. So at this COP, if you talk about geopolitics, clearly it will also be a discussion on whether climate finance also applies itself to common but differentiated responsibilities with respective capabilities. Are there other countries who are in status where which is changing as compared to what it was 20 years back? Is the donor base going to expand, and is funding going to come? In the end, all of these will be interconnected narratives as well. I mean, 450 gigawatts target and how the implications will be, whether it's how it's achieved. I'm not a technical expert, but in my understanding, even 175 will be a tall order. We are still about 140 gigawatts or thereabouts, and if we are really looking at tripling renewable energy across the world, in terms of number juggling, will mean something like 11,000 gigawatts of renewable power by 2030 alone. A lot of it will have to come from solar. A lot of it will have to come from countries like India and China. We are at a very difficult point right now in terms of what that tripling could actually mean. Few other things into the mix. One of the speakers also spoke about it, CCS and the fetish for it. And again, I'm not an expert, but to the extent I'm a COP watcher, and I'm at least a watcher of how the narrative on climate is evolving, it feels like the 95% of discussion is going to be on what will be the answer to an extent of 5 to 7%, which is what most industry experts will say CCS is about, which means that there is technology that you can reduce emissions, so it's not a problem, and that will be the panacea for success. But perhaps not, and I suppose the questions to throw out here to experts who are watching this space is, if CCS and solutions that are technologically driven are the ones that are going to reduce emissions in the long term, how do we juxtapose it with real solutions which are about ramping up renewables and not more and more getting into solutions which could classify them as green campaigners would call false solution. I'm not even getting into the complexities of firing a coal plant along with ammonia, the implications of that. We opened the panel by an acknowledgement that we cannot dethrone coal. I suppose we don't need to dethrone coal. We will come to a point in the next couple of years where the generation mix itself will look very, very different due to several and many reasons. So in a multipolar world, probably you will have multiple kings and you will not have one king alone. And that's the reality to think about in the coming times. Few other things as well, mostly in terms of narrative assessment and stuff that has been said before already. Hydrogen, if you look at how the media is reporting on hydrogen, on the one hand, it feels that it's the Hail Mary. It's going to solve all problems for everyone. As you will have green hydrogen, suddenly you will have all the solutions. I don't know what the answers are, but definitely there is something to be said about what's the value chain of green hydrogen. What about putting up a renewable plant which will produce electricity that is green, which will then be fed into an electrolyzer which will break water, and you will create hydrogen, which is in a hydrogen plant itself, and then that will be reconverted to transport. I'm sure there is lots to be said in terms of the efficiency across every rung of this value chain, and whether anyone across the world has been able to crack it. But definitely, just in terms of its ability to do decarbonization and India's ambitions on still, not just ambitions, but our growth trajectory and how we will industrialize, definitely it feels like green hydrogen will have a large role to play, and that's something which we can as well have a voice when all these discussions are happening in the global arena. I suppose today is also the follow-up of the G20. The Prime Minister was supposed to host another summit. It's a hashtag Voice of Global South. So India is also taking, just talking a little bit about the geopolitics of things. When India is negotiating at the COPs, and that's how we observe it, India's own stance has also evolved in terms of its position, not just among the large emerging economies, but also how it wants to be seen as the voice of the global south. And I suppose all of these things do assume some importance, especially when we are talking about deep decarbonization, we are talking about solar, we are talking about private investments, public investments, how the latter can leverage the former, and so on and so forth. And the fact that we inducted Africa into G20 and made it G21, the fact as well that Africa committed to 5 times tripling of renewables when the world itself committed to 3 times, it just feels that we are living in a very, very confusing world out there where there is no shortage of ambition, but there is huge shortage, at least globally, and in geopolitics on what climate finance should look like. And as I said before, any ambition will just be pointless without finance. So I suppose when we are also talking about decarbonization, there is some discussion as well on how to make sure that it is enabled, and it is enabled properly. When I speak to experts, or we talk to experts who are watching this space, we are given to understand that technology is not a problem. If technology is not a problem and geopolitics-wise India is fine, then where are the roadblocks which are not making us, really be on the highway that we must be on in terms of climate? But that said, globally as well, things are quite gray in terms of how different countries are saying one thing and pushing quite another. And again, I will not get into the politics of it, at least at this stage. I will speak of 2 other offbeat things, if that's useful, because we've spoken a lot about the power sector here. We've spoken a lot about industries. Steel itself is going to capture a lot
just a
of...
couple of minutes, because then we can take a round of questions and then...
Steel itself will capture a lot of imagination, but if there was somebody who could talk about the role of electric vehicles and how new things are being said and done there, I thought that itself will be useful. I will just allude to 2 recent news reports that I read, which I thought were very useful, just in terms of like how the decarbonization in the transport sector is looking. One was the CEA report, which actually talks of vehicle to grid. Itself seems like a very interesting phenomena because 80% of the time a car is just sitting idle. There is always a discussion on how, there is intermittency in renewables. So if you can actually generate power from there and put it back into the grid, I thought was a very unique concept which more and more states could buy into. And the second thing which as well I read was something about the second life of batteries, and again experts would know better than me, but if the batteries have been expended in one place, how is it that they can just be used as power banks? And a lot of European automobile companies like BMW, Mercedes, etc., are already putting that kind of a system where a battery which has been used in an electric vehicle is used as a storage or like a power bank just to store energy. And more or less to say that while there are several ways and means, right from the point of view of how geopolitics will talk about decarbonization, and how, in Shishir's example, Mr. Gupta will talk about decarbonization, a lot of reality will lie in the middle on how just enabling policy will make that happen. And at least from a narrative point of view, just also giving that impression that the policy is really enabling. We are moving a few steps ahead and not either standing there or taking steps back. I will end only by saying that watch out at this COP. Again, the favorite narrative of the COPs is always whether we are doing fossil fuel phase down or phase out. Perhaps in the real world it does not hold any meaning, but it will hold a lot of meaning in the next 2 weeks.
Thanks. And just on the second life battery, we just put out a publication on it yesterday. So please look out for that. It's a broad canvas. I'm not even going to try to summarize. But any questions for any of the audiences? Each of them had very unique sort of perspectives and depth. So any question? There's one question in the back, one question here. Yeah.
India has got very large companies like Adani Power, Tata Power, Suzlon, etc. in market cap running in lakhs of crores, but the ecosystem is not there. For example, in US they are using drone technology, etc. to analyze these solar panels, etc. regarding the availability and to optimize all that. But in India, the smaller players are not getting that sort of ecosystem to develop. Even recently, we learned that in the coal sector, we are finding that partnerships are going, new business models are being searched. But in the renewable, the ecosystem is not developed to that efficiency.
Thanks. One question here, someone. Let's take 2-3 questions. Anybody else? Any other question?
Current total installed capacity of solar, all kinds, whether it is rooftop or plant, total, what do we have in India now?
A.K. Jain, I'm from the urban sector. Thank you for all the panelists for giving such a distilled presentation about their very rich experience. It has raised a lot of questions also, besides providing some answers. My question is to Mr. Sambit Basu. You gave very interesting figures about the GDP and India becoming a $38 trillion economy by 2047. My question, which comes to my mind, in the past, if we see the trends, the consumption of the electricity or demand of the electricity corresponds with the growth of the GDP and also the emissions. So do you think that the demand for energy will be about 8 times what it is today by 2047, and also the emissions? Thank you.
Yeah, so maybe you can start.
I can take the first 2 questions. To your question, sir, on ecosystem and scale, India is still, there are players in India that are using drones to monitor solar plants. I think one thing very important to realize is that a lot of our large solar plants, or generally if you look at the developer community, is backed by pension funds and backed by foreign capital, which is very mature, and they are bringing best practices into the country. Number 2, the ecosystem was not there till now, but it is growing. India has increased its exports of, I can only speak about solar, by 364% the last fiscal, right? And the reason is multifold. Some of it is geopolitical, some of it is us getting competitive. The reality is that over the last 20, 30 years, we have not been very strong at manufacturing at global scale, and China has been far ahead of us. Even in solar, China is about 80% of the market already, regardless of the part of the supply chain. So I think it's time, we have to be a little patient. I would say give it another 10 years and you'll see two areas. One is battery storage and EV, and the second is solar itself, where you will see a lot of indigenization happening. Sir, it's about 70 gigawatts.
I just checked the
60
data.
is, yeah, okay.
72 is what?
72, yeah. Please.
I was lucky to be involved in the National Solar Mission when it was being put together. So I was asked to make a statement in, European PV Association conference. When I said our target is 20, I was ridiculed openly, saying, what are you talking about? You, India, you are going to touch 20, and just I got the number. It is 72. And this is not too far back. This was 2010-11. 2010-11 to 2023, we have gone from zilch to 72. And that has been done in this country. The ecosystem is coming in. Probably, I'm just, correct me if I'm wrong, ma'am, probably we have broken the inertia and possibly hitting that tipping point. And it could be an avalanche. That's a hope.
Thank you, Mr.
Yeah, so I will first answer the question on the ecosystem. I think the one part of the, just adding on to what already has been spoken, is R&D. I think what we said is that, see, when you create an ecosystem, there are various levels. One is that whether you put the right policies in place, right regulations in place, legislations in place, that is one. Second is that in terms of technology also, there are two sides. One, the users, the other one is the manufacturers, okay? So depends on who you are inquiring about the ecosystem. As Sir rightly pointed out, that we have really grown tremendously over the last 10 years. And I mean, even on a best of times, 17 gigawatt was added or something like that, but in an annual basis. So on the, while developers are really going gung-ho, and in terms of the question is that, do you see a kind of consistency between where the technology is going to come from? I mean, at the end of the day, you're going to have the equipments, right? I mean, if the equipments, are they domestically produced, or are you exposing yourself to kind of security, energy security issues because you're procuring from elsewhere? What are the cost kind of issues involved in that? Who controls it? At the end of the day, natural resources, who controls this? Processing, who controls this? Manufacturing, who controls it? So there are various planes to it. And also it is not just important about pushing more of that same technology, but how do you manage it in a grid? Okay, how do you manage the kind of composition of the demand? So it is not just a question of having the right ecosystem, it's the ecosystem of the overall thing. Regarding the other thing about yours, sir, about the GDP context of it, the reason I wanted to mention is that the growth has so far been driven to which we jumped the queue. We moved from the agriculture or the primary to the services sector. So we really missed that aspect about the industrial growth. Now, as we move forward, we said that we're going to be in terms of the working age population, it's going to be maximum in the world, is going to be in India in 2030 or so. We are going to have a large population, young population, all these things we have talked about. Now, if we are talking about growth, and growth to be driven for what? For development purposes, for creating infrastructure, for creating all this urbanization. So if it is urbanization, industrialization, all these things will not be based on services sector, right? I mean, you have to create on the basis of industry. Now that is something, and we are talking about Atmanirbhar Bharat, self-reliance. You can't have all of that on the basis of just the services sector, right? So if you do that, there's a clear economics which talks about the energy and the intensity of the energy of the use. That is going to change. And if that changes, how do you manage your emissions and energy intensity? One is the hard-to-abate sectors which talked about, the budget allocations which were there, whether it is in terms of infrastructure, railways, all of these. And you also have to recognize that just a very simple thing. It's very easy to say, let us move away from the coal or whatever it is. There's so much of dependence which is there, economic dependence. Even if you forget about simple things, the states are one part of it. Look at Indian railways. 1,400 million tons annually is moved through coal, right? And their 47% of their revenues are depending on that. And that's what goes towards subsidizing the tariff for the passengers. How do you manage this? How do you manage a whole sector on the basis of just going decarbonization? You can't wish that. And it's not just a question of adding more renewables. It's about having a portfolio, a basket, which will allow you to grow, to develop, while not compromising the other areas of the trilemma. So that's the challenge, that's the balancing which is required.
Thanks. Kajol, Aarti, any last words? Kajol, maybe you want to start?
And just on the question on utilization of different technologies for solar potential. So I just wanted to touch upon a little bit on that. So there was one project which was being done by one of our partner in Bangalore, which utilized a similar technology for mapping the solar rooftop across Bangalore. And there are several tools which are already available in the public domain which looks at the overall solar potential. So over the time, even the GIS mapping, the satellite maps have also improved. And they are quite becoming helpful in understanding how much at least is the solar potential. You can do that by understanding only at the rooftop space. But when you look at the actual potential, you have to go actually on the ground to understand how much is the connected load, what are the potential around, because there are other assumptions than otherwise you have to take. So these are only the ballpark figures that you can put around for the solar potential. And there is another tool that WRI is also trying to develop, which looks at the cluster level, how much would be the overall solar potential. I think in the next session, we'll be speaking a little bit more about that. So, but there are already these things which is happening. So it's not that, it's only happening outside. We do have some of these examples from India as well, but it's just about how do we scale them up, how do we accelerate, how do we replicate, and how do we put it for the other audiences as well. So yeah, just wanted to add that one thing. Thanks.
So even national steel recycling policy also envisaged for the because India is mostly dependent on the import of the dependent on purchase the steel scrap. So we should think about the recycle of the steel scrap for using the electric arc furnace as well as the induction arc furnace.
Sure, I can probably. So yeah, I completely agree on that. Like we do need to have all these solutions. So it's not just about producing the fresh steel, but it's also a lot about recycling and utilization of the scrap. And when we look at the steel projections for the 2030, there is already this kind of the assumption that the steel recycling has to be accounted while we look at the production of a steel. But again, it comes at like how the recycling needs to be done is like segregation of the steel, which is very important because at the source side, we have to have a well segregated steel and then creating that logistics around to bring it to the industries and then providing the efficient technologies at the secondary steel level for the recycling. So that's where the whole supply chain discussion and then utilization of the proper policies and the utilization of the technologies and putting right finances around all of this becomes a very important discussion.
Thank you again. So with that, we'll close this session. Again, if you can see, and Mr. Sambit actually talked about all of these issues, right? The fact that the energy transition is happening, we're going to have this big economic growth, we have a young population, so we have to create the jobs, we have to do the energy transition. And how do we, so it's touching all sides of economy. So how can we really make sure that these cross-sectoral conversations happen, cross-sectoral policies evolve? They are not at cross purposes, but actually, add up to greater than the parts. And I think this is really the time period in India, I guess I would say the next decade, where a lot of opportunities are there. The avalanche is coming, and how do we actually, make sure that we are able to fully leverage the opportunity that is there. So thank you again to the panelists, and with this we close this session, and over to Lanvin.